Greg here, and this is another short video about some of the things that I've learned about being a cybersecurity consultant successfully over the last 5.5, 6 years, with the idea that maybe some of my experience might help you if you're thinking about going down that road or if you're already down that road. And certainly I'm always wanting feedback. If you have some great ideas, please let me know as well too. But this is all me trying to help you with a few things that I've learned over the years. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity consulting specifically. That's not to say that some of the things that I'm talking about won't apply to other consulting areas, but these are things that have come to top of mind as I've gone through my cybersecurity consulting career. So the first one is kind of obvious. We're talking about least privilege here. You want to make sure that wherever and whenever that you do have access to something of the clients, that it's the least privilege of what you need to have access to. I know you're probably thinking, well, duh, I mean, that's kind of like a basis of an information security program. Well, sometimes I've seen where clients have provisioned access for me, for example, to do like, say, a firewall rule review, that for whatever reason, I was given more than read-only access. I was actually given rule writing privilege. Now, I definitely don't want that for a couple of reasons. First of all, violation of least privilege. I'm not writing firewall rules as part of the virtual CISO engagement. That's not what we do. But we do review them in order to make sure that there's, check and balance, the second line of defense. Make sure that there's nothing in there that could pose a serious risk to the organization. But if I have access to write things, not only does that violate least privilege, there's no reason for me to have it. I could easily make a mistake. I could be in there and accidentally delete a rule and never know it. And now I have set the company up and me up for liability. And I don't want that. I want to make sure that my liability in any engagement is as small as possible. That is one of my primary goals, and that should be the primary goal of any client that engages with us and any service that the client engages with outside of us. I mean, that's kind of an obvious thing. You want to make sure that you keep things as tight as possible. And that also includes need to know. I don't have a need to know, for example, if I'm working for a bank, I don't have a need to know any account numbers, customer information, balances. I have no need to know any of that. And I don't want to ever have a situation where I'm given access to core with all of this information. There's no reason for that. Even if you're like a full-time CISO at a bank, there's really very little or no reason for the CISO to have access to that information. And that helps with the separation of duties, for keeping in the three-line of defense model. So I'm trying to think if there's ever been a time in this almost 6 years that I've done this that I have had access to the client's information. If I think of one later, I'll let you know, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. Now, number 3, whenever possible, try to use the client's infrastructure for all of the things that you're doing, all of the information of theirs that you're looking at. Let me give you an example. One of the things, obviously, that the virtual CISO does is to work with corporate policies. It's kind of a basic thing, but where entirely possible, I would rather work with the policy within, say, their G Suite or their Office 365 environment instead of extracting it to my computer or to the vCISO services infrastructure, because now I'm taking on a little bit of liability. I have the company's information, my client's information on my infrastructure. Now, obviously, too, it's like I want to try to limit that as much as possible if I do have to do it. I want to make sure that I have the proper protections in place. We'll make sure that only certain team members have access to certain clients' information, that sort of thing. Again, we're getting down to least privilege and need to know. But you can get around that risk if you try to emphasize to have an account, say, within their organization. So that could be an Office 365 account. It makes it easier, too, when you're doing collaboration with your client, because now you can share internally in their infrastructure and not have to create an external share, and which is more complicated, but certainly that's another thing that you can do as well, too. We do that for some clients where it just makes more sense. You can use a Citrix ShareFile or SharePoint in Microsoft or some other sharing, so long as, of course, you put in the proper controls, two-factor, and all of that. I'm not going to go down the two-factor. The next one that I thought of, and I scribbled down a few notes when I was doing this, the next one I thought of was in the instance of where this is an actual instance where if you're doing social engineering, and I don't do much social engineering in what I do, but that's certainly a component of cybersecurity physical penetration testing. You know, going on site to an organization and trying to pretend that you're somebody else and basically gain physical access to areas where thereby you can show that you can exfiltrate information or have access to the network, that sort of thing. If you're doing that, it's often best practice to carry what I like to call a get out of jail free letter, and that's something which basically is an authorization that you are doing a penetration test that's authorized by the organization. You have been challenged, and upon your response to the challenge, you produce this letter, and that way everybody's happy, because that's part of the point, is that when you're doing social engineering like that, you're trying to see if you're actually going to be challenged. So hopefully that would be a pass, right? But when you're challenged, you want to say, okay, the gig's up, because obviously if they think that you're a criminal, which they're probably thinking at this point in time that there's something not right, you need to emphasize that, no, you're authorized. So far, so good. That's the way to do it. This is not the way to do it, particularly like if you're in a bank. And I'm paraphrasing how this happened, but it did happen. I did not do this. This is a story that I heard. The pen tester, upon being challenged, said, you're right. I'm not here to fix the printer. I'm not who I say I am. Let me show you why I'm here, and reaches behind him to get the letter. But think about it. You're at a bank. Think about what the pen tester just said. What are you thinking? You're thinking you're about to get shot, most likely. So when you answer the challenge, just be cognizant of the environment that you're in, okay? I can't stress that enough. The fifth one is ethics, and there's a whole suite with regards to ethics. We in cybersecurity, by almost want to say definition, but certainly by role, we're entrusted with a huge, huge amount. We have to approach our job ethically, and that includes making sure that you don't misrepresent yourself. So I'll give you a couple of examples there, real-world examples. One would be, I was just talking with someone on the podcast that they had related a story where, that's the Virtual CISO Moment podcast, if you're not familiar with that, where this gentleman, he worked, I can't remember where he said he was working, but in essence, the discussion had grown about virtual CISOs and some of the pros and cons, some of the good ones out there and some of the bad ones. And he said that again, I'm paraphrasing, and it's not exact, but that in his experience that sometimes virtual CISOs, particularly from MSSPs, are really there as more like an insider to the account. In other words, they're not really there to help build the program, never mind the fact that part of our discussion was the presenting the virtual CISO something that they're not. We'll get to that in a minute. But they're in, and their main goal is to try to upsell a tool that the MSP is going to be able to manage for them. So instead of like having the concern of the client first and foremost and top of mind, their top of mind is making a sale, making an inside sale here. Hey, that's why sometimes keeping the virtual CISO service separate from your MSP, which is what I promote, that's why it's preferred, and that's why as a provider of virtual CISO services, we will not step into that other arena, being an MSP, because I don't want to cross the stream. So it's not to say that it can't be managed that way, that it certainly can. But you got to be cognizant about that, and you got to make sure that you have your client's best interest at heart first. That's number one. And number two, and I've talked about this on the podcast, do not misrepresent yourself. There are so many people that are calling themselves virtual CISOs out there that aren't truly risk management professionals. They're more like technical cybersecurity managers. Or as the same guest on the podcast that I was talking about, as he said, that sometimes that in his experience, the virtual CISOs had no cyber experience and very little IT experience, and it seems like that the thing that they were best in was billable hours. And I hate that, because the true virtual CISO is such a benefit to an organization. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think that. I'm so passionate about it. But don't misrepresent yourself with that. Don't misrepresent yourself with a degree, for example, where sometimes companies that don't do background checks for education, you might be missing whether or not they actually have the valid degree that they say that they have. I will do background checks on education. I'll do criminal background checks, and don't misrepresent yourself on any of that process, because if I were to bring on someone who misrepresented their credentials in any way, shape, or form, present that to a client, and then somehow that got out, my company now is hugely liable, and I'm not going to do that. And you can't do that either. And so if you're at the point where you're building your firm and you're bringing on contractors to help with you, make sure that you vet your resources properly, because your clients are expecting that. And one other thing about misrepresenting is, and I came across this with a new client some time ago. I was going through their initial, we do an initial request for information when we start with a client, because we want to figure out the as is. Depending upon scope of what you're doing, you want to do that as well too. If you're doing something like a penetration test or a vulnerability assessment, you want very limited information. The whole point is to try to figure it out yourself from the perspective of an outside criminal trying to get in. But in our perspective, it's the other way around. We want to know as much about what's the current environment so that we can start to assess risk and gaps and then figure out how to fill them. But this one particular thing, talking about misrepresentation, this firm had provided a penetration test, which was nothing more than a vulnerability assessment that went wrong, that wasn't done correctly. They ran a vulnerability assessment. This was actually, if you're familiar with this is OpenVAS, and when you run, and presumably with using Greenbone, and to me it seems like that they had a standard discovery on, and I believe that that's ICMP. I don't want to get too technical, but long story short, they ran the scan. They didn't get any vulnerabilities. Well, if you look at what the scan result was, they said that there weren't any targets. So the first thing we did is, when we got in, we ran a scan against those targets, and with the idea, configured it, assuming that they were up, and found some vulnerabilities. But that's bad enough. But the company that ran this presented it as a penetration test. They said that we conducted a penetration test over X number of days, and we found this is our process for doing a penetration test. It involves some automated stuff and then some manual stuff to try to get in. We found no vulnerabilities, so we were not able to get in and do anything. Which, yay, I mean, the company found that and thought, hey, well, that's a great penetration test right there. We don't have an issue. But they didn't do anything. They didn't find anything. So, that's a misrepresentation there. Don't do that. And then finally, don't do anything without explicit authorization. So if you're running a penetration test or a vulnerability assessment, make sure that you have the authorization to do so. I know that sounds obvious, but sometimes we tend to get overzealous. What can happen is that if you're running a vulnerability assessment scan and you do not have the authorization to do so, and at the same time something happens in their environment which causes a business continuity incident. Whether or not that scan caused it, you will automatically be assumed to be liable for it because you were running a scan. That's the only thing that changed, they'll say. You were running a scan that everything was working fine until you started the scan, and now everything is down. And you might face something as simple as like, okay, we won't do that again and continue with the client. You may lose that client. Or it could even get to the point where they're going to come after you for losses. And so now you start talking about things that you need to think about for your small business, including liability insurance. And we'll talk about that in the next episode. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying these. Again, I always welcome feedback. Only put this on the YouTube channel and on a link from LinkedIn, and you can always drop comments in there. Thank you. Appreciate your time.